Car's main target owners were young professionals and the smart new family man who still fancied his chances with the ladies. But subliminal dream images of speed, sex and romance could also prove irresistible to those lower down the social scale, like aspiring Essex boy racer Dave Harley.
When the Capri came out, you just looked at it and you go, my God, that is just, I haven't seen a car like that before. You know, not one that I could afford. I've seen cars that are beautiful in magazines, but they're like, you know, I'm 17. You know, I'm just a kid. I can't afford, you know, even if I could, I wouldn't be able to insure it. But that was the power with Ford. They would offer a dream that was accessible.
When new Capri owners moved up a gear and bought the next model in the range, their second-hand cast-offs allowed a new class of owner onto the road. Waiting in the wings to snap them up were the boy racers.
It didn't take long. Once the Capri was 2 or 3 years old, the boy racers had their hands on them. You know, and once we got our hands on them, we made the most of them because they were a great, great car. I mean, they didn't just look great, they drove great. And when I got in my Capri, I just felt the bollocks. I just thought, I am a dude in this car. When you got in a Capri, they had a sports feel to them. They had the nice dash, you had the rev counter. Having a rev counter was a big deal because most cars didn't have them then. They were a car that were built around. You got into it and you went, yeah, this is a car that I've dreamt of owning. It felt like it was my homemade car, you know. That car was made, produced and designed in Dagenham, and that was the, you know, the Essex boys' car of choice.
But the making of these dream cars was a very different story. In fact, many Capris were not made in Dagenham, but in Germany, part of the new merged Ford of Europe. One reason Dagenham lost out was because of its discontented labour force. In 1978, half the men working in the body plant that year got their cards and left. They were casualties of a drive towards greater cost-effectiveness, necessary for survival in the ever more competitive international car market.
How many people do you want now for 52? You want another 10 men?
Replacements were hard to find. When Keith Dover began work on the Dagenham assembly line in 1978, there was no shortage of vacancies.
You'd walk in slow getting into the place to clock on, and everyone would be saying like that, you'd get some coffee. So everybody would be like the living dead, you know, going into work like that. And then at the end of the shift, totally different. Everyone couldn't get out quick enough.
Run it round in circles. Well, run it. As you got all this labour on there, just keep running it.
If getting a job at Dagenham was relatively easy, keeping it and surviving the stresses and strains of the production line was notoriously difficult.
On the assembly line, you had no time at all. You was committed to that job, and God, it was so boring, you know. And you'd do that over and over, the same job, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you'd go in for 8 hours, maybe if you're doing overtime, 10 hours at a shift. And what you do, little tricks. Oh, like you'd think, oh, look, I wonder how Arsenal are going to do. And I would have imaginary football matches where I might be playing, winning the FA Cup or designing something in my head. Anything just to get yourself out of it, you know. And you could eventually, once you'd learnt the job, you could do all this, and your mind could be totally, and you could do it without thinking. But if you were new to that assembly line, man, it might look slow, but once you started, it seemed bloody fast because you had to get your bit done before the next guy took over. So he didn't really appreciate it if you weren't finished, because if you slowed him down, then he'd be out of sync.
More and more black and Asian workers were recruited to work on the assembly line. Shop steward Roger Dillon was surprised how easy it was to get a well-paid job there. He soon found out why.
Basically, you were tied to the line. Once that line started, every second was accounted for. If a cycle of one car would be, say, 1 minute, 20 seconds, you would possibly have 10 seconds to pick up a part, 10 seconds to walk to the car, another 5 seconds to get yourself in position with your tools, another 5 seconds to do whatever. And that would all add up to, you know, maybe 1 minute, 5 seconds. Then the remaining 15 seconds was allowing you to walk back up to the line, back to your station, to pick up your parts, to go to do the next car.
Many began at Dagenham only intending to stay a short time. Those who stayed on the assembly line too long could be driven crazy by the repetitive tasks they had to perform.
There was this guy who was an inspector, middle-aged, very mild-mannered, intelligent guy. Then all of a sudden, it was like the scene when Basil Fawlty attacks his car. He goes berserk, and he's got a new rolled-up newspaper, and he's hitting this engine, and he's shouting, and he's swearing at it. And I said to the guy I was working next, I said, what's going on there? He said, oh, take the notice, he always does that. I mean, what do you mean? He said, oh, he just loses his temper sometimes. And I said, but look, he's having a row with the engine. He's actually arguing with it. I said, look, he's hitting it. But the rest of the guys were sort of looking at me. He said, well, what's your problem?
After Ford's new family car, the Fiesta, rolled off the production line in 1976, everyone joined in with this pantomime performance to promote the image of a happy workforce. Sadly, in the 70s, one day in every 4 had been lost to strikes and stoppages.
The line worker always seemed to be angry about something, and it was because of the nature of the work. People would store up all this anger, and then when something went wrong, that was it. They just lost it. And my job, a lot of occasions, would be to get them to calm down. And what would calm them down is if I actually lost it. If they saw me actually shouting and screaming at the supervisor and him screaming back, it was a bit of theatre. So rather than them do something stupid and them walking out, or then, you know, where they could lose their jobs, they were quite happy to see me screaming and shouting at the supervisor.
The loss of production due to constant disputes was a nightmare for Ford managers. Some play-acted their way through the minefield of conflicting interests.
You'll find your prop shop.
Sometimes you have to appear pretty damned intractable and say, well, it's thus far and no further. And if that's going to make you guys go home, then recognise that you've gone home for some days or even some weeks, because we ain't going to bend on this one because of its consequences. And that's the sort of poker bluff, if you like, because you never want anybody to go, and certainly not for weeks. And least of all, because when people do go on strike for a long time, actually getting hold of them to talk them back is an extra problem, because grudges will only have built.
Ford's tough line on cost control and production targets meant that despite all the stoppages, Dagenham and Ford in Britain remained profitable at a time when the homegrown British car industry was going bust. But in the 70s, Ford's operations in other countries were proving much more cost-effective, and the abiding memory of this decade at Dagenham is one of loss and regret.
Whenever possible, my middle and last part of the day was simply to walk to the end of whichever process it was and look at the cars going up the lift or look at the cars going off the end of the line. Because at least you can see that despite all the frustrations and all the tensions of the day, something is still coming out there. There is nothing, well, probably is something sadder, but at the time there didn't seem anything sadder than walking around a giant car plant, you know, which from end to end probably has 5 days worth of production. So 4,000 vehicles in one state or another, not moving. And you know that what should be happening is thousands of people earning their wages, turning those into cars, and when it sits there quiet and empty, because nobody's in at work, and there's those thousands of, you know, on their way to birth cars and nothing happening, that's really very sad indeed.
In 1984, the Dagenham dispute that changed women's history finally came to a head. 16 years after the sewing machinists first demanded recognition of their skills in 1968, they again came out on strike. Leading them was Dora Challingsworth.
We said, right, OK, the only way we're going to get what we want is to all walk out. So that was it. Everyone went, and they was out for, I think it was about 5-6 weeks. We brought the place to a close. because no one could work without the seat covers. The cars can't go out without seat covers.
After rejecting the women's claim, Ford agreed to independent arbitration, and the women won their case.
We was up in the manager's office this morning. We went up there and sat there till nearly 10:10 when the news come through, and it was really great. We went down on the floor at 15:15. We had a meeting with the girls at 10:15, and there was, cheers and crying, and it was really great.
It was all there. We knew we was going to win in the end. But the day they was told, they just went, absolutely mad, the women. I don't think anyone worked after that.
The victory was bittersweet. Ford was one of the world's largest multinationals, and Dagenham had become just one of many plants making cars in different countries.
In sales terms, Ford is the third largest company in the world. It employs 480,000 people in over 100 countries and builds over 5 million cars, trucks and tractors every year.
By the 80s, the fierce international competition facing Ford was heightened by the huge success of Japanese car makers. Ford responded by shifting production to other European countries, like Spain, where labour was cheaper and costs were lower. Dagenham began shedding thousands of jobs, and the foundry started to look vulnerable.
We're talking about a unique foundry, the biggest foundry in Europe. And it had all the required skills under one roof. That in itself made it unique. Such a mass of men of wide and varied skills under one roof, it couldn't disappear.
In 1985, the foundry closed down. The rationalisation of production continued throughout the 80s. The reduction of the workforce was accelerated by the introduction of automation on the assembly line. The writing was on the wall for Dagenham.
Dagenham came from an era where they were technologically no longer going to survive and was so riddled with a distrust between management and workforce that you could have written that script, and I think many of us did, years before, and said it's going to end up with this ceasing to happen here. That doesn't mean you're pleased when it does. The fact that you foresee something coming doesn't stop it being regrettable in its own way.
The closure of the foundry, once at the heart of the whole plant, was the beginning of the end of car making at Dagenham. For some, it was a welcome relief from drudgery, but a proud tradition of craftsmanship would also be lost forever. Vivid memories remained for Dennis O'Flynn, who went on one last walk round the foundry just before it was demolished in the late 80s.
All the extracting units are closed down, the air ducts are finished, everything. It's a dead area. And as I walked around, particularly in the moulding lines and that, I swear I could hear the ghosts of yesterday's men. All these blokes that I work with, who had contributed to the improvement in working and living standards and wages of the Ford Motor Company. I swear, as I walked around there on my own that afternoon, I could hear those voices.
The heyday of Dagenham, when it employed over 50,000 and was the largest producer of cars in Britain, is now a distant memory. Car production at Dagenham was closed down in 2002. Today, it still has a workforce of around 2,000, making all the company's diesel engines for Europe. But all Ford cars are now imported.
The question begs to be asked, where the hell are we going from here? But I don't think what we'll ever see is the likes of the Ford Motor Company and its magnificent contribution to the national as well as the local economy. I don't think that will ever be equalled again, tragically.
The end of the Dagenham dream is part of the bigger story of the decline of car making and manufacturing industry in Britain. Dagenham's finest hour was in the 60s and 70s, when it produced the Ford Cortina, one of Britain's most iconic cars. Despite shifting its car production abroad, Ford has remained our most popular brand, a name that will always be fondly remembered for the American-style dream cars, now long gone, that once broke the mold.